Welcome everyone to day 2 of the Newburyport Literary Festival. My name is Jennifer Entwistle and I'm the co-director of the festival. This is our 16th year and this is our biggest event ever. We've got over 100 panelists joining us this weekend. We had a great day yesterday full of events, and we have another day planned for you with 3 tracks of Zoom events going on today. So I hope if this is the first time you're tuning in, that you'll check out the schedule and see if there's anything else that you want to watch this afternoon. We are using Zoom webinar, which means that you can see and hear the panelists, but we can't see and hear you. So we encourage you to use the chat for discussion throughout the event. But if you have any questions for the authors, please put them in the Q&A tool. There's a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, Q&A. And we will queue up questions and do a question and answer session towards the end of this event. I also want to thank A Mighty Blaze for partnering with us again this year. They were part of our effort to go online last year when the pandemic struck, and they are partnering with us again. So I am live streaming this event to their Facebook page. Thank you to the Blaze. And my last bit of housekeeping is to mention our local booksellers. Yesterday was Independent Bookseller Day, but in my mind, every day is Independent Bookseller Day. We have 2 that partner with us, Jabberwocky Bookshop here in Newburyport and the Bookshop of Beverly Farms. So once this event gets started, I will put links to those 2 bookstores in the chat window. But of course, if you have a favorite bookseller in your neighborhood, please don't hesitate to buy from them as well. We just want to support all of our local indies. And now let's get started. I want to introduce our authors. Melissa Korn is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in New York, covering higher education. Previously, she wrote for Dow Jones Newswires. She's a graduate of Cornell University and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. And Jennifer Levitz is a national reporter for the Wall Street Journal in Boston, covering general news, economics, and politics. Previously, she wrote for Providence Journal. She's a 2-time Pulitzer Team finalist, and she graduated from Loyola University of Maryland. So welcome, Melissa and Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Jen. Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
So we are going to talk a little bit about our reporting of the book, some of the backstory behind this crazy Varsity Blues scandal, and we definitely want your questions. So please, throughout, post your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to them. We'll leave some time at the end. Before we get too far into the book itself and our reporting approach, we want to take a minute and walk you through this scheme that hit newsstands, hit the airwaves back in March of 2019, and really just captured the attention of so many people for quite a while. So the scheme itself was an effort to get teens into colleges that maybe they otherwise would not have gotten into. Kind of a lying, cheating, stealing sort of approach here. So there were 2 prongs to the scheme. And the first had to do with testing. So Rick Singer, whom Jennifer will speak about a little bit more in a bit, he hired proctors and paid off test site administrators to allow his proctors in to fix the wrong answers of his clients' kids. So he would fix the answers after they took the test, or in some cases, if the teen was in on it, he would feed them the correct answers while they were just sitting there in the testing center. The other prong had to do with athletic recruiting, and Singer would pitch his clients' kids as star athletes, whether it was water polo or rowing or soccer, a bunch of different sports. He would create these fake profiles, kind of an athletic resume, Photoshop their faces onto pictures of other athletes, and he would work with a coach and sometimes an administrator at the school to get these students flagged as recruits, even though everyone knew they weren't top athletes. And when you're a recruit, you're flagged as a recruit by a coach, it's about as close to a guarantee as you can get at some of these really selective schools. So that's kind of the framework that led to this entire crazy story and crazy scandal. And almost as crazy as the scheme itself was how we all found out about it. So Jennifer, do you want to talk a little bit about what was going on back in
Yeah.
March 2019?
It was March 12th, 2019. Started, it was a typical day. I came into work, I had a coffee. I was like, going to have a writing day because I had been reporting, I'd been out of town. So I came in, I sat at my desk and was kind of looking forward to the day. And then press releases started coming across, which is not unusual, but you could tell something really big was happening in this case because we were getting bombarded with news releases from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston saying there's going to be something big happening. They wouldn't say what at 11. And then from the FBI in Boston, and then their DC counterparts saying, get, something big, alert. So of course, we knew we had to be there. So off I go. I trot down to the courthouse, which is about a 10-minute walk, and go into the Boston Federal Courthouse, which is the most beautiful courthouse in the country, big windows, up to the 9th floor. And everyone's there, the US Attorney and the head of the FBI in Boston, the head of the IRS, and several prosecutors are all on the stage. And very quickly, you realize this is huge. The US Attorney gets up and says, this is the largest education scam ever prosecuted by the Department of Justice. Not only that, but the people involved were, as he described it, a catalog of wealth. And there's a large document that we get as we sit down. And so Melissa's in New York and she's also listening in to the call. So we're working together and we're just reading the names and it's just jaw dropping. And you can't get your head around how many people are involved, not only like 50 people, and they're being rounded up by authorities as he's speaking, woken at their homes in LA and Greenwich, Connecticut and other places. And it's elite schools, it's families. So it was just obviously a huge story that immediately sort of had it all.
Right, and Jennifer and I were covering it for the Wall Street Journal. We quickly teamed up and worked with a few of the editors in New York and a few of our colleagues around the country, just knowing it was kind of an all hands on deck sort of situation those first couple of days, which was exciting. But we were frankly hadn't even begun to catch our breath from the torrent of updates and to the main news article and side stories about profiles of these people and kind of throwing it all together as quickly as possible when literary agents started reaching out. So this is how it turned from us writing a bunch of stories for the journal to writing a book. And we're very grateful because this is not the way it normally happens. We know usually, you're begging agents to take a look at your manuscript or your book proposal. And we had them reaching out saying, this is absolutely going to be a book. Do you want to be the ones to write it? And I called Jennifer up and said, hey, we've barely ever worked together before. We don't know each other very well. We both have day jobs that are quite demanding. Neither of us has written a book before. Do you want to do this together? And she said, sure. So off we went to put together a book proposal. And once it got accepted by a publisher and we decided to go with that publisher, we kind of sat down and realized, okay, now we actually have to write the book. And we knew that we wanted it to be about more than just what was in court documents, because frankly, that large document that Jennifer referenced, this 204-page FBI affidavit, that alone could be published and be a fairly interesting book. Like there's just so much material there. And as the case has wound on, there's a lot of really interesting facts and details and juicy stuff in the public record. But it was so important for us to go beyond all that and really dig into the motivations of the individuals, the context, why this whole scheme even happened, why people felt the need to cheat to get into these top colleges, and just really get inside the heads of everybody involved. So there's so much material that we were able to get for the book that wasn't in anywhere else, that we couldn't find anywhere else. It was just, from a year of really dogged reporting. And one of the areas in which we really kind of dug deeper was Rick Singer, the ringleader of this whole scheme.
Yeah, Rick Singer was a really fascinating character right from the start. He was a college counselor in Newport Beach, California, and by all accounts, a very good one. Basically, people would hire him to just the normal things, help find the best fit for your kid, highlight what they do best, essays, all that. And he was sought after. But he had, not only did he have this, legal part of his business, but he had this whole illegal part that just grew and grew. And if you got to know who Rick Singer was, it sort of made sense. I mean, from the time he was little, the biggest thing that defined him was his love of competition. He loved to win. Whether it was just a pickup basketball game or, whatever, he had to win. And so he was this guy who came up, he was very numbers driven, he was target oriented, he was organized. He kind of had a chip on his shoulder from growing up in sort of a lower middle class background and feeling like he wanted to be on the wealthier side of town. And the amazing thing was the way that he managed to get himself in with this very elite circle of people. He appealed to a lot of business people, a lot of just people who didn't have a lot of time. He was just like, I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to do this. And he was brusque and he could be rude, but he sort of spoke the language of some of these people. And he likely learned about the loopholes to do this scam because from his time as a coach. He came up as a college coach. He coached basketball at Sacramento State. And so he knew the advantages of athletes and the lack of oversight. And he got out of that after, in the 90s, and he was a legitimate counselor in Sacramento. But there were signs even in the late 90s that he was willing to take sketchy paths and stretch the truth, and that there were parents willing to pay for that.
Right. So there were times when he would, fudge the truth or encourage his clients to outright lie. But then it just grew so much more egregious as time went on. So again, he started with these middle class and upper middle class families. And then especially as he moved down to Southern California from from Sacramento, the clientele shifted a bit and the stakes grew higher, it seemed. These families were looking at the most selective schools in the country often, and they knew that it was a long shot for anybody, but they didn't want to believe it was a long shot for their kid. And it's not like these kids were actually disadvantaged in the admissions process in any meaningful way, right? They were wealthy. Their parents were connected. They probably knew trustees at these schools. They could afford test prep and private tutoring and private tennis coaches and violin instructors, and they had every resource possible, but there was still this feeling that they needed extra help. And so much of it came down to, this phrase that an academic, Tony Jack, used in his New York Times review of our book, which I kind of just want to adopt now, is they were looking for bumper stickers and bragging rights. And that's really so much of what this was. It was, I want my kid to go to this school that has certain cachet in certain social circles, and I am willing to do anything it takes to get them there. And that drove a lot of it, but there were kind of a few different motivations that the parents had for all of this. And it's not easy to, it's not fair to just paint with a broad brushstroke and say they were all selfish cheaters. That's part of it, but it's a little more than that.
Yeah, I mean, we get asked a lot about, what drove people to engage in this, and a lot of people, quite a few parents, more than 30 now, have pleaded guilty, and they've generally given, a variation of three reasons. One, some of them just admit it was my ego. I wanted my daughter to go to a good school, and I just lost sight. Others have said, it's insecurity. Or misguided love. Quite a few of them said, I just wanted the best. I love my child. In reality, I mean, I think there's no doubt they did love their child. They did want the best for their child, but somewhere along the way, there was a huge entitlement. I mean, because every parent, out there loves their child and wants the best, but that somehow they thought they were sort of entitled to this, and that they, and also that they could get away with it. They combined, there was, I think, a real degree of hubris going on here, and sort of an obsession with status. And I thought this one counselor we spoke with put it really well. She said she sees people and they've come up through very elite circles and all the right private schools and everything. And then they get to the college process and they find that they're not going to continue in exactly maybe that level that they thought. And they just kind of are in shock. And I think that's why Rick Singer was appealing, because he was offering, he wasn't saying that to them. He was saying, yes, we'll get you there.
Right. Well, we'll find some way. And as Jennifer said, dozens of parents have pleaded guilty. A number of coaches who were charged have pleaded guilty. Rick Singer himself pleaded guilty, and a number of his lieutenants. There are still a handful of parents and a couple of coaches and one university administrator that have pleaded not guilty. They've maintained their innocence, and they are headed for trial this fall. So that's we're kind of giving our requisite disclaimer that not everybody who was charged in this case has pleaded guilty. There are a number of defenses, and frankly, some people who pleaded guilty have continued to try to deflect blame since, even in their sentencing hearings, they'd be standing in front of the judge and their lawyers would be arguing, yes, he did it, but there was always a but. Rick Singer worked him over, he was naive, or there was still just this inability for some parents to take ownership of their actions, even when they legally pleaded guilty. And even after serving prison time, some of them have continued to push back against the facts of the case, because they just frankly want to get so far away from it. And Jennifer and I have continued to have conversations with a number of the parents charged in the case. We started talking to them very early on, started talking to their legal teams, their crisis communications teams, because these are people who can hire top-notch white-collar criminal defense lawyers and top-notch crisis communications crews to shield them from people like us. So that was part of our job, was getting past all that to connect with the parents and some of the kids themselves, which I think helps us paint a more human picture. Jennifer has this line, I'm going to steal it from her for a moment, that generally the more you know about someone, the harder it is to hate them. And in most cases, that is true. I think there were probably a few parents here that the more we knew, the deeper the foot went in the mouth as they continue talking. But for the most part, right, they're not these two-dimensional caricatures of awful parents. There's more to it than that.
Yeah, I think one of the best, the most interesting parts has been for the past several months, talking with readers and hearing how people respond to the parents. And some people are just like, oh my God, what are these people doing? What do they thought they needed extra help? Think about somebody who didn't have the money to go to college, all that. There's some schadenfreude out there, like, well, good, they watching people tumble, and then just kind of people find it sort of, mind-boggling, and there's some anger and resentment. And then I think that there's, the ability, like in the extremes, these are the extremes, but you can sort of recognize, maybe some people can recognize something in that. Okay, I wouldn't go that far, but what would I do? Maybe there's other things that I might do or I have done. So that's interesting too. Some of them are more relatable than others.
Yeah, I found that one of the challenging things in reporting this was, I'm a mom, I want what's best for my kid. She's a lot younger than these the kids involved in this, the teens. But at some point, you do have some of those same insecurities. And as I'm seeing, as I'm learning more and more about those insecurities of some of these parents, it's a little uncomfortable for me to think, well, yeah, no, I felt that way too when she was that age. And I've wondered that too. And yeah, I'm going to go ask my community for advice on who's the best fill in the blank expert to help with this parenting problem. And, there's something universal about that desire to help your child succeed and to help them avoid disappointment. But reporting this book also helped me remember the importance of having them experience that disappointment. Oftentimes, the college admissions process is the first real blow to a teen's ego, kind of at this level, right? But it's often more of a blow to the parent's ego. It hits the parent harder. The kid bounces back. We had one former head of a very Tony LA school say, kid gets a rejection letter, they rebound. Mom and dad don sackcloth and ashes, right? Like they're in mourning over this, and the kid's like, yeah, that's a bummer. I'm really disappointed, but this other school looks pretty great. I'll be fine. And it helps keep all of that in perspective, I think, when you read these stories of these parents just gone so far off track.
One of the things one question we wanted to answer was why did some parents go along with Rick Singer and some did not? How did he find it? How did it come to be? Did he just go in and say, hey, I have this scam? Like why did he think some people were amenable to this? Because we know there were plenty of parents who didn't want anything to do with this, walked away, and others went in. So how did it happen? And what we found is that, as his name spread as the guy who could get you in, there were literally some people who just called up and were like, I want to do this deal. Like, I don't have time for this college admission crap, get my kid in, right? There was some of that, very transactional. And then there were others who crossed the line very slowly. They hired him for legal services. And then somewhere along the line, there was some kind of coded and then very uncoded language. And then they just got on board. And they went to great lengths to try to justify this, and almost comical lengths at some point to keep this secret. We have a whole chapter on a mom in Beverly Hills. She's rather well known as a parenting expert herself, who hired him to have someone take her son's test in Houston, but she had to convince her son that this was happening, that he was really going to take his test. So she went so far as to tell her son she'd gotten permission from the ACT to give him the test at home, and she sat him down and she timed it and then took the test at the end, and she actually put in an envelope, mailed it to Rick Singer, God knows where. It wasn't going to ACT, and just to somehow tell herself it was happening. But it was amazing the lengths that people will go to. That I think a lot of people, the fact that he had the guise of the charity helped a lot. So it was fascinating to see the different degrees of how people got enmeshed in this.
Right. And we try not to be preachy in the book, but this scandal doesn't live in a vacuum. It's not like Rick Singer came along and these parents came along and they just met and it was kismet and they realized there was, an opportunity here. It was in Unacceptable. We dig a lot into what this whole scheme says about society at large, that people felt the need to go to such extreme lengths and that they got away with it for so long. And I think there's a lot in the college admission system that is fairly broken. And this scandal highlighted so many of those fault lines in a number of different ways, whether it's the kind of gray area of legal donations and at what point does that become a quid pro quo? I'll give you $1 million, you name this professorship after my mother, and also you'll get my kid in. Those sorts of deals, the extreme autonomy that college coaches have in picking their recruits, and the trust baked into the system, both trust in the coaches in those situations and also trust in the applicants that they're telling the truth on their applications, and there's really no verification of all of that. So, we're at a moment, I think, in America right now where there are all these discussions about fairness and equity and access. It's all part of the national dialogue. And there's this one scene in the book that I think really touches on so much of that. I'm going to take a second, read just a couple of paragraphs here. I've got my trusty book. So this is at the sentencing of Felicity Huffman, and she was the first parent to be sentenced in the case. So this was in September of 2019. Goodness, that feels like forever ago. Okay. Presiding over a packed courtroom on Friday, the 13th of September, Judge Talwani held her eyeglasses between her thumb and index finger and peered out at the solemn defendant before her. The judge had been reflecting on why there was a sense of moral outrage in the college admissions case. It wasn't because the public had suddenly discovered that it's not a true meritocracy out there. It wasn't about the financial harm to the colleges or the testing agencies that had generated the technical infighting at the courthouse in recent days. The outrage, she said from the bench, is a system that is already so distorted by money and privilege in the first place. And I think that touches so much on why this resonated with so many readers, whether it was readers of the Wall Street Journal articles, readers of People magazine and TMZ. There's a little bit of that schadenfreude that Jennifer mentioned and kind of celebrity gawking, but it's also just such a core question of what is fair? Who deserves these very difficult to get spots in these very elite schools? So that always really resonated with me, and it seems to have resonated with a lot of our readers as they go through the book and see just how the system worked and how the system is broken to allow for the scheme to work.
Yeah, so I'll just wrap up and say, I think the people who say, well, the victims here are, of course, like the families that played by the rules and didn't get in, but to some degree, the victims were also the kids that, that the parents did this for. And some of them, they didn't know. And of course, they've got now academic records completely marred for life. And just this embarrassment of being put out there, like you couldn't do this yourself. Your parent had to bribe you, get you into school. So we did end up speaking with one of the teens at length, and I think to date, it was at the time was the only interview with any of them, and he was just really open. And he said it exposed a larger problem of parents being too invested in their kid's life. Not financially. I mean, you can give your kid out the best schools, all that, but too invested in their accomplishments, too eager to take, their accomplishments. Too eager to tout their accomplishments as a sign of your own, your own self-worth, and parents being too, too much seeing their kids' success as a reflection of themselves. And he said that kids could really sense that, and it was a weight. And he and his friends always spoke about that. So it's kind of a cautionary tale as well.
And Mateo kind of took over his own narrative, right, by talking to us. Jennifer, you were the one who had the long conversations with him, but I think that was something that really struck me, right, was that his parents had kind of run his life for a long time. They had told him, this is what you do, and he had listened to them, and including standing in a backyard pool for some photos. But then when he talked to us, I mean, that was a turning point for him, it seemed.
Yeah, exactly. It was really interesting. He spoke after, kind of thinking about it for a couple months. He agreed to talk, and then I remember, he said things about his parents. They were overly invested. So the way we work as Wall Street Journal reporters is you have to contact everyone if there's going to be anything about them, to let them know and give them a chance to reply. So I had to call the family's lawyer, and there was just silence on the phone. They were so freaked out that he had made the decision to speak because these people all had handlers all around them, crisis communications. They're very scripted lawyers. They had a whole narrative down. And here he was just going off on his own and speaking for a national publication and a book. And they were just sort of, oh my gosh, what did he say? They wanted to do damage control. But then from what I heard, and apparently the dad was in prison at this time and was freaked out. Oh my God, he's blown it. He's ruined it. Then the story came out and he looks great. He looks mature. He gets his side out. He makes clear that he could have gotten into all kinds of schools on his own, and he did. So we helped him in that way. And then also it showed them that, like, wow, he can make good decisions, and so he was able to reclaim his voice.
Yeah.
I'm back. So I wanted to move to the Q&A because we've got some great questions lined up. And actually, I find this whole piece about the kids so fascinating. And I wanted to ask, and you kind of started down this path. So did you wind up talking to any other of the kids, or this was the only student that you wound up talking to?
This was the only student we spoke to on the record. We've gotten insights from a lot of members of a lot of the families, but Mateo was the only one who was going on the record at that time. Since then, Olivia Jade Giannulli did Red Table Talk, kind of a TV interview, and Jack Buckingham's little sister did an interview because she wrote a book, not about this, but she wrote a book. She's like 16 or 17 years old, maybe. And so she chatted a little bit about being the younger sibling of somebody involved in this. But really, so many of the kids didn't know what was going on, what was happening to them.
That was the
And
next question was, did they all even know? So they did.
Some did.
Yeah.
Some were totally in on it, every step of the way. Others kind of were generally aware that their parents were maybe pulling some strange strings to help get them in. And then others were completely in the dark and just crushed on March 12th, 2019, when their parents were arrested, when they came home. And, it was kind of a, how could you do this to me sort of question. And why didn't you believe in me? And we know that there's been a lot of family counseling, a lot of doors slamming, a lot of, kind of going back and forth on silent treatment to the parents, right? These are relationships that have been probably irreparably damaged between parent and child for a lot of them.
Actually, one of our questions from Mary is, any comments about the long-term effect on the students whose parents engaged in this behavior? So there's probably a few sides to that, like long-term in terms of their relationship, but also, in the world, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, there was several students did lose their academically, there's going to be long-term effects. They had to really readjust. Several ended up leaving the schools. They had to, in one case, like with Jack Buckingham, he ended up going to the school and saying, I could do this myself. And they let him stay because he did have good scores outside of the fake ones. So, I have to think for some of these kids that it's hard to say whether there's some kind of trauma they went through, but whether they're going to have like, post-traumatic stress or growth, I guess, remains to be seen. I think for some of them, certainly it's going to be it's going to be hard, but perhaps for some of them, it was like, with Mateo, I felt like he's probably going to use this in some good way. It sort of reordered his, relationship with his father. And, in the end, the dad was like, wow, this is really about me. This isn't about you. And I think he could realize, like, he'd see himself as his own person and his dad with his own problems. So I think it's going to take a while to know exactly what happens here.
Yeah, and a lot of the kids, as Jennifer said, were kicked out of school or left on their own before they could get kicked out, or their offers of admission were rescinded. But the scheme had been going on for so long, right? Like, the prosecutors generally focused on the 2011 to 2018 period or 2019 period. But we know that Singer was doing these deals at least since 2008. So there were some students who had gotten into college, graduated from college, gone to grad school, and had done just fine. And that was the crazy thing, right? Is once they got there, they did all right, a lot of them. They got decent grades, they could have done it. But, they'll always have that asterisk behind their name now.
Right. So let's see, we've got a question from Meg. College admissions this year took some surprising turns, partly because of the pandemic and the decision by many schools to go test optional and the huge rise in applications to selective schools. Do you think this scandal affected how colleges look at applications now?
I think that's a great question. I think to an extent, yes, but I think that was part of a broader movement by schools anyway to really be focusing on what has an applicant done with the resources they've been given, right, and the opportunities they've had. So if they've had a really easy life and everything's been handed to them, then those A minuses and, you know, 3 clubs and 1 sport don't look that amazing. That's shocking. You're expected to do that. But if you haven't had all those resources, you've had to fight for them, you've had to find them, you're also holding down a part-time job, whatever it is, you're navigating this with a parent who hasn't been through the process themselves. That's a sign, you know, that teen has done something particularly impressive. So I think that was part of a broader shift. I think schools are more attuned to that. Some schools have said that they were going to verify and try to fact check a little bit more of the application. But honestly, they're never going to check every detail on every application. They don't have the manpower for that, nor do they have the inclination to do it. They need to just take people at face value.
No.
So it's given a little shift. I do think it's funny that the scandal isn't what made schools go test optional, right? This idea that somebody could pay off a test site administrator and pay off a proctor and completely corrupt this testing apparatus. That was fine. Like, sure, a couple bad apples, we'll keep using these tests, no big deal. But it was the pandemic and the inability of students to get to take a test. That's what finally got schools to move away from the exams.
So we've got another one, nothing against California, but this seems like a very California story. Could Rick Singer have done this so successfully in any other state?
Oh, I think so. I mean, he had a lot of clients from New York City. He had clients in Illinois. He had clients in, Greenwich, Connecticut, Massachusetts. I think the common denominator here is a very, I think these kind of very hyper-competitive communities where this is in the air. There's like something in the culture. And I think people can see these kind of communities all over the place.
And what were the consequences for Singer? Did he get prison time along with the parents?
Singer hasn't been sentenced yet. So he pleaded, and this is something we get into in really fun detail in the book, but didn't have time to during this conversation, just how the feds got to Singer and got him to flip, because he was one of the first cooperators in this whole thing. And he just handed over his Rolodex. It doesn't usually work that way. But because he was a cooperator, because he helped, there's an expectation that he won't get the maximum sentence possible, but they're waiting until after or at least most of the other parents and other people go through trials or have their, plead guilty and are sentenced, because his sentence will be somewhat based on how helpful he ultimately is, right? If everyone is convicted or pleads guilty, that makes him look a little better in the eyes of the prosecutors. They'll recommend a slightly lighter sentence. So he's out right now, awaiting sentencing, and the sentencing date, we don't have one yet. It'll be a while still.
Interesting. Is this the tip of the iceberg in terms of this type of scandal, or do you see this as an isolated incident?
We know that there's been other mini Rick Singer events that, there's even before him, there was someone doing this with families from China. There's been incidents of certainly like the SAT test cheating, sort of like he took it all. He took all the scams and then sharpened them and then created some new ones. So I don't know if there's anybody that is as big or as broad as Rick Singer doing this. It would be interesting to know, but he didn't create the cracks in the system. He just exploited them.
You talked about some parents didn't want anything to do with it. I'm surprised nobody blew the whistle. They knew that this was happening then and they opted out, but they didn't do anything about it either. They just let it keep happening.
There were some close calls. Somebody would kind of raise a red flag or say, this seems a little strange. And it wasn't necessarily apparent. We say that the people who are kind of closest to heroes in all this whole thing are probably 2 college counselors that were at private high schools in the LA area, who kind of realized something was a little bit off. And one of them, when they flagged it to Georgetown University, Georgetown did a fairly superficial investigation and ended up the kind of disciplining the tennis coach, but not noting or not noticing that there were like a dozen other people who the prosecutors ultimately said, got into Georgetown this exact way. So they kind of kept their focus a little narrow. And another, was kind of told to just stop asking questions. So there was a couple people who tried, and there was one college counselor. One of my favorite things is this one independent college counselor who had heard that Jack Buckingham had took his ACT at home. She called the ACT, she tweeted at them, and they essentially just said, stop asking questions, it's fine. And they didn't quite believe that this could have happened, so they didn't really take it seriously, it seems. It was kind of, there are a few very extreme circumstances in which somebody could take the test at home, like if you're a homebound, disabled young adult. Other than that, you really can't take it at home, but they just kind of said, oh, maybe that person got that special dispensation and just ignored her.
And I'd add too that there's this sense of fear among some of the parents. Like we have an interview with a parent who declined Rick Singer's offer, and he was very nervous that Rick Singer was going to sabotage his kid's application to another school, to the point that he wouldn't tell him where he was going. He was terrified because Rick Singer had a lot of contacts, but he also he made it sound like he had a lot more contacts than he did. He'd say, my guy at Chapman or this or that. And the parents thought that he was plugged in at the highest levels. So they were like, that's a big reason why they didn't want to say anything against him. He just seemed to have a lot of power, and maybe he could put a bad word in there and hurt their kid if the parent didn't go along.
Yeah. So where do you think the line is? There are a lot of elements where some kids are more privileged than others. What school you attend determines the quality of the guidance counselors, prep courses, private coaches, personal relationships with schools, etc.
It's it's a tough call, and I think I view this all as being kind of on a spectrum. You've got trying to figure out which side to use here. You've got the the kind of very basic hiring a private college counselor, test prep, or even before that, just what school the kid's going to. There's all different levels of privilege here. And then you've got, we call the chapter in our book, the gray area, which is what I was talking about before with the donations and at what point is that a quid pro quo. But then at the very extreme end, perhaps even off the edge, off that spectrum is what Rick Singer was doing, which was just so egregious and so far beyond appropriate, taking advantage of the privilege you're given. It was, you already had all this privilege and then you went and sought more. So where the line is and where the line should be are probably two different things. It depends who you're asking, because frankly, I get reader emails when I write journal stories from people saying, I live in Greenwich and I'm discriminated against because I'm an upper middle class, white male. So for them, the line is a little further over perhaps than it is for some other families. It really depends on kind of where you sit in, where you're situated, what you think is extreme.
Yeah. What accounts for the difference in length of sentence for Lori Loughlin and her husband, probably one of the most famous parents in this whole case? Why did he receive a longer sentence?
Yeah, so the judges looked at several things when they went to sentence the parents. They looked at, did you involve your child? Okay, you're going to get more time for that. Did you do it for more than one child? You'd get more, you'd get a premium for that. Did you take a tax write-off? That added more time. So it was all these factors that went into it. And when it came to Lori Loughlin and her husband, he was the money guy in this. So he was the one sort of working with Rick Singer to do the financial deal. And he was a little more involved in that way. So he got more time. He also had a very unfortunate encounter with the guidance counselor, where this is one of the counselors who was like, "Hey, I don't think this individual Rose Crew," and started to check into it. if you recall, they had presented their daughters as, rowers. And so he started to snoop around, and Giannulli marches over to the school and basically really dresses this guy down and scares him, and he backs off. And in court, the judge said, this is basically the equivalent of you telling someone, don't you know who I am? And he just did not like that at all. He just thought that was the height of like arrogance. Not only do you do this, but you're gonna because he went over there and was like, basically said, I'm the tuition paying parent. Like I can make your life miserable to this guidance counselor. So I think that really hurt him with the judge.
Good. So I wish we could keep going because I love this whole topic. I think it's fascinating. And I can tell that everybody on here does too, because there are some questions we didn't get to. Some of them I think we did touch on, so I skipped over them, but I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question because I do have to wrap up. We've got more events coming. So Melissa and Jennifer, thank you so much. This has been an absolutely fabulous conversation and a great way to kick off our day 2 of the festival. So thank you so much. And I wish you success with the book.
Thank you.
much
Great
for having
question.
us.
Yeah, it's awesome.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining. And I hope we'll see you at some other events today. Have a great day.